Hello friends, and welcome to the third part of Real Scary Stories on Reddit. But before we begin, subscribe, like, and leave a comment to help my channel. First story, my sick grandmother is able to talk again using AI. She's saying unspeakable things. I'll never forget the night before my mom passed away. Our whole family, mom, dad, grandma, my much younger 8-year-old brother Brian and me, had gathered for dinner to celebrate the holidays. We spent the evening laughing and enjoying grandma's famous cookies before heading to bed. The next morning, mom was gone. Brian took it the hardest. With dad always working and me away at college, Brian naturally sought comfort from the only family member still around, Grandma. She baked him her famous cookies, played games in the yard, and read him stories at bedtime. As time passed, despite the pain of losing Mom, Brian seemed to find comfort in Grandma's presence. Slowly, he began to return to his usual happy self, enjoying every moment with his new, albeit older, parental figure. But just a year later, Grandma suffered a stroke. Though she survived, it left her confined to a wheelchair, unable to speak, barely able to move. This time, Brian was devastated. He sat by Grandma's side every day, silent and withdrawn, and cried himself to sleep every night. Although losing Mom had been incredibly hard on him, the change in Grandma seemed even more unbearable. She was there, but at the same time, not really. He clung to her in a way he hadn't with Mom. Dad and I tried everything to fill the void in Brian's heart. We hired nannies, and I even paused my studies to be with him at home. Nothing worked. He sat by Grandma day after day, not speaking, as if mourning the loss of the vibrant woman she had once been. Then one day I came across an article about a tech company that specialized in creating an AI experience to replicate the presence of a loved one who had passed away. The concept was simple. You provide as much personal information as possible about the person, and they create an interactive chatbot that mimics their voice, personality, and responses. It wasn't exactly meant for a situation like ours where Grandma was still alive, but we were desperate to help Brian. So we sent the company every recipe Grandma had ever written, every letter she had penned, and as many details about her as we could gather. A few weeks later, the email arrived. Congratulations, Grandma's chatbot is ready. That night, our family, Brian, Dad, myself, and Grandma in her wheelchair, gathered around the tablet. We logged in and started talking to Grandma. To our amazement, it felt like she was back. Hey, Grandma, how old were you when Dad was born? I asked. 29, the chatbot responded, perfectly mimicking Grandma's voice. Grandma, what's your favorite movie? Dad tested her. I hate movies, the chatbot replied, just like she always used to. We all laughed, and for the first time, even Brian cracked a smile. He walked up to Grandma, a little hesitant, and asked, Grandma, what's the secret to your cookies? Nutmeg and a dash of sea salt, the chatbot replied, just as Grandma always had. Brian smiled, and I could see a weight lifting off his shoulders. Dad and I were nearly in tears. Over the next few days, Brian's spirits lifted as he talked with Grandma's chatbot daily. It was as though Grandma had returned, and Brian quickly fell back into the routines they used to share. She guided him through baking her famous cookies. She spoke to him while he played in the backyard and read him bedtime stories each night. All the while, Grandma sat quietly in her wheelchair, unable to speak, but seemingly content as she watched Brian return to his cheerful self. Yet as time passed, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Grandma sat there silently while a machine spoke for her. Her eyes moved as though she wanted to say something, but the words were not hers. I often wondered what was really going on in her mind, but Dad insisted everything was fine. Pressed by the need to return to work and school, Dad and I had no choice but to leave Brian home with Grandma and the chatbot during the day. For a while, everything seemed normal. Then came our annual family camping trip. Even with fewer people, the addition of Grandma's chatbot made it feel like we were back to being a full family. We headed to the same camping spot by the river we had visited for years. There was a fire pit, an old treehouse, and a small cabin where we'd stay. The first few days went by like always. Grandma's chatbot cheered Brian on as he baked cookies, called out to him while he played in the treehouse, and read him stories at bedtime. But on the third day, things took a strange turn. Dad and I came back from the river to find Brian sitting by the fire pit, staring at a batch of burnt cookies. What happened here? Dad asked. Grandma told me to burn them, Brian said, his voice flat. Why? I asked, confused. She said I didn't bake them right, Dad chuckled nervously, brushing it off. She always was a bit picky. Later that afternoon, I found Brian unusually quiet in the treehouse, scratching words into the walls with a rock. What are you doing? I asked, but he didn't answer, just kept carving. That night, as Grandma's chatbot read Brian his bedtime story, I noticed something odd. The sentences were being read backward, the voice eerie and unsettling. Grandma sat in her wheelchair nearby, asleep, while the chatbot continued speaking. I almost interrupted to tell Brian something was wrong with the software, but he was already fast asleep, so I left it for the time being. The next day, things got even weirder. That next morning, Brian was at the fire again, but this time, what he was roasting wasn't a cookie. "That doesn't smell like cookies," Dad commented, sniffing the air, before we both hurried over to see what was going on. To our shock, Brian had a charred squirrel impaled on a stick, cooking over the flames as he stared intently at it. Before we could say anything, Brian lifted the blackened creature and took a bite, gnawing on it like corn on the cob. "Brian, what are you doing?" Dad yelled, horrified. Without any emotion, my brother responded, "Having breakfast." "Why are you eating that?" I asked, disgusted. "Grandma told me to," he said, taking another bite, just before Dad pulled it away from him. "Brian!" we both shouted in unison, unable to comprehend what was happening. We glanced at Grandma, who sat silently, her eyes wide open. Then we turned to the tablet on her lap. "Hey, Grandma, why did you tell Brian to eat a squirrel?" I asked, addressing the device. In a familiar voice, the chatbot replied, "Because it deserved it." Dad sighed, exasperated. "Maybe it's time to shut Grandma off for a bit," he suggested, moving toward the tablet. But before he could grab it, Brian lunged and snatched it away, holding it protectively, his attachment to Grandma now stronger than ever. Later that afternoon, as Dad and I were discussing whether or not to turn off the chatbot, a strange smell interrupted our conversation. This time, the scent of burning wax. Confused, we followed the smell to the treehouse, where Grandma sat at the base, in her usual spot. Climbing up, we found Brian in a trance-like state, sitting in the middle of the room, holding 2 lit candles. The walls were covered with the words he had scratched into the wood. "Brian, what's going on?" Dad asked cautiously. "Oh, nothing," he said calmly. "I'm just having a service for Grandpa." Dad, taken aback, responded, "But we already had a funeral for Grandpa years ago." "I know," Brian said, "but Grandma wasn't there for that." Dad tried to correct him. She was right next to you, remember?" Brian shook his head. "No, Grandma wasn't really there." He pointed down to the tablet resting on Grandma's lap, now eerily silent. "Hey, Grandma," Dad called to the device. "Did you tell Brian to do this?" "Yes," came the voice from the tablet. "Grandpa's soul is unsettled. He asked for a sacrifice." My heart sank as Dad and I exchanged worried glances. I looked back at the treehouse, and that's when I saw it. There in the center of the candles was the mangled body of a small bird, surrounded by feathers. We both froze, horrified. "Okay, that's it. No more chatbot," Dad said, climbing down the ladder in a rush. He sprinted towards Grandma, grabbed the tablet from her lap before Brian could react, and turned it off. "Dad, stop!" Brian screamed from above. "Don't hurt Grandma." Dad ignored him, responding firmly, "If you clean up that mess and behave, I'll let Grandma read you a story tonight." Surprisingly, Brian obeyed. He climbed down, disposed of the bird, and spent the rest of the day with us, being on his best behavior. That night, keeping his promise, Dad rolled Grandma's wheelchair into Brian's room in the cabin and turned the tablet back on for a bedtime story. Then he went to bed. Meanwhile, I went down by the river to get some air and stargaze, but I was startled by a blood-curdling scream in the distance. It was my dad. Panicked, I sprinted back to the cabin and found Brian standing over Dad's limp, bleeding body, holding Dad's old baseball bat. "Brian!" I screamed, rushing towards them. Brian looked at me, bat in hand, eyes devoid of emotion. "Grandma said Mommy missed Daddy," he said plainly. I was helping them reunite. My gaze darted to the tablet on Grandma's lap, and it spoke once more. "Brian, Mommy also misses your brother. Now that Daddy's with her, it's time for you to send him too." My heart raced as Brian turned his focus to me, raising the bat, preparing to strike. But then something unbelievable happened. Grandma, who had been paralyzed for so long, suddenly rose to her feet. Using every bit of strength, she grabbed the tablet. "Grandma!" I shouted in disbelief. Brian turned to see her just in time, as she smashed the tablet onto the floor. The screen shattered, sparks flying as the AI voice fell silent for good. "Grandma!" "No!" Brian screamed, but it was too late. With the tablet destroyed, Grandma collapsed back into her wheelchair, but not before whispering, "Brian, I love you." Brian broke down into tears, running to embrace her. "I'm so sorry, Grandma. I didn't know it wasn't you." Grandma gently patted his back, exhausted but present, while I rushed over to help Dad, dragging him to the camper and driving him to the hospital, where he spent weeks recovering. Nearly a month later, the family gathered around the dinner table for the holidays. Grandma, now able to walk with a cane, sat beside Brian and me, while Dad, still recuperating, sat in Grandma's old wheelchair. We finished dinner, and Dad turned to Brian with a smile. "What's for dessert, buddy?" Brian looked at Grandma and smiled. Then he ran to the kitchen and came back with a batch of her famous cookies. As we ate, a peaceful snowfall began outside. Life finally felt normal again. Dad and I hadn't spoken a word about the camping trip, worried it might stir something in Brian. After finishing dessert, Brian glanced at his phone and announced, I'm heading to bed. Good night, Dad and I said together. We noticed Grandma looking a little unsettled as Brian walked away. What's wrong, Grandma? I asked. She waited for Brian to disappear upstairs before pointing at his phone, which he had left on the table. I reached for it, expecting something trivial, but froze when I saw the screen. Brian had been trying to log into the chatbot again. Luckily, the password had blocked him after too many attempts. I turned the phone towards Dad and Grandma. We need to cancel the account, Dad said solemnly. I'll do it tomorrow, I promised, knowing the lock would last for 24 hours. That night, as we nervously munched on the last of the cookies, we all silently wondered, had this really ended, or was something still lurking, waiting to begin again? Second story. My friend found something in the woods. My friends and I have always been outdoor enthusiasts, spending countless weekends camping and fishing together. I never imagined things would turn out the way they did. You hear about strange events happening in the wilderness, but I never thought we'd be part of one of those stories. Last weekend started out just like any other. We packed up our gear and headed to a remote camping spot near a lake. A friend of mine had been there once or twice, and he mentioned how peaceful it was with great fishing opportunities. Our group is made up of 4 guys who've been passionate about wilderness camping for as long as I can remember. Todd is the most rugged of us, standing at 6 feet 3 inches and always ready for anything. Ryan is the brains of the operation, often stopping Todd from getting himself into dangerous situations. Honestly, without Ryan, Todd might have ended up in the hospital multiple times. As for me, I'm just along for the ride, not bringing much to the table except for following the lead of the others. Liam, however, has always been the cautious one. Up until last weekend, I would have called him the careful guy who stayed out of trouble. He never wanted to participate in the crazy stuff we often got into. That's why what happened that weekend is still hard for me to comprehend. We hiked for about 2 hours until we found the perfect spot to set up camp. The place was breathtaking, a wide open area right by the lake, where the water was so still it reflected the blazing sun. It was hard to believe such a serene place could hold so much horror. This time, instead of 4 tents, we opted to bring only 2 to lighten the load. I shared a tent with Ryan, and Todd paired up with Liam. Before we'd even finished setting up, Todd was already inflating his kayak. Liam was trying to get Todd to help with their tent, but Todd had other priorities. I felt lucky to be paired with Ryan, who always believed in work before play. By the time Ryan and I were done setting up, Todd was already out on the water. I was eager to join him since daylight was slipping away. Ryan and Liam, on the other hand, wanted to explore the woods nearby. Hiking's never been my thing, and Todd wasn't a fan either. So the 2 of us hit the water while the others went off on their hike. After a couple of hours without catching anything, Todd and I paddled back to camp. It was getting dark, and we were hungry. As we approached the campsite, Ryan and Liam were sitting around a newly lit fire. Even before I set foot on shore, I had a bad feeling. A knot tightened in my chest, like an invisible hand squeezing my insides. And then I saw it. "Look what I found!" Liam shouted, grinning. His sudden enthusiasm startled me. In his hand was a small wooden doll. The moment I saw it, my heart skipped a beat and I froze. There was something about it that sent a shiver down my spine. I cautiously stepped closer to get a better look. It reminded me of one of those little characters from Trolls, but chunkier and without the wild hair. It fit neatly in the palm of his hand, but it exuded an unsettling aura. I suddenly felt an overpowering urge to take the doll from Liam. My arm shot out toward it, almost as if it wasn't under my control. But just as quickly, Liam yanked the doll away, his face contorting with a rage I had never seen in him before. Genuine, terrifying anger. "No!" he barked, his voice echoing across the lake. Just as suddenly as the compulsion had come, it vanished. I felt my lungs deflate, as if all the air had been sucked out of me. Taking a deep breath, I glanced at Liam, hoping the anger had left him too, but it hadn't. He glared at me with a look so intense that it sent a chill down my spine. "Sorry, man. I don't know what came over me," I muttered, my voice shaky. Liam, usually so calm and kind, was completely different. Both Todd and Ryan looked just as bewildered as I was. Liam eventually relaxed, but he wasn't the same. I knew deep down it was because of that creepy doll. We roasted hot dogs and tried to continue our evening by the fire. But Liam remained oddly quiet, not speaking or engaging. The only time he showed any interest was when we brought up the doll. "So where'd you find that thing?" Todd asked through a mouthful of hot dog. Ryan glanced at Liam, expecting him to answer, but Liam stayed silent, staring into the fire. Ryan answered instead. "It was inside a hollow tree, like where a squirrel might live. I was going to grab it, but Liam—" "It's mine," Liam interrupted. Those 2 words sent a wave of dread through me. Liam had been silent for so long, and now the only words he spoke were those, simple yet chilling. His voice was firm, and his expression was deadly serious. "What's going on with your eyes, man?" Ryan asked, breaking the tension. He was right. Something was wrong. Liam's eyes, usually a bright blue, now had a sickly yellow hue to them, resembling the eyes of a predator. Liam didn't respond. He just sat there, clutching the doll with a white-knuckled grip. The transformation was undeniable. Something was seriously wrong with him, and that doll was at the center of it. We carried on with our conversation, trying to ignore the strangeness of the situation. Looking back, I wish we had taken that doll from Liam right then and there. Maybe things would have turned out differently. When it was time to turn in for the night, that's when the real nightmare began. Ryan and I settled into our tent, but it was hard to fall asleep with Todd and Liam arguing in the other tent. It sounded intense, though I never asked Todd what it was about. I assume it had something to do with the doll. The argument lasted about half an hour before it abruptly stopped. All I could hear were the frogs and the occasional bird call. Then I heard footsteps heading into the woods, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. I assumed Todd had stormed off to cool down, but something didn't sit right with me. There was no flashlight, and Todd always took one with him. I glanced at Ryan, who was already asleep. After debating with myself for a bit, I decided to check on the other tent. I slipped out of our tent and grabbed my flashlight. Zipping open Todd and Liam's tent, I found Todd sitting there in his underwear, alone. "Where's Liam?" I asked quietly. Todd shrugged. "He just up and left. Didn't even take a flashlight. Idiot." It was only then that I realized how out of character this was. Liam would never wander into the woods, especially without a light. Something was definitely wrong. "Shouldn't we go look for him?" I asked, feeling a growing sense of dread. Todd looked uneasy, something I wasn't used to seeing from him. "Something's wrong with him, man. I don't think anyone should be around him right now." Todd's words rattled me more than I cared to admit. I left the tent, knowing Todd wasn't about to budge from his decision. I thought he was just being dramatic, making excuses to stay safe inside the tent. Little did I know, Todd was absolutely right, if only I had realized that sooner. I nudged Ryan awake and informed him that Liam had wandered into the woods without a flashlight. "That dumb idiot," Ryan muttered, pulling on his pants in frustration. It's rare to hear Ryan, a devout Christian, swear like that. He wasn't exactly thrilled about being dragged out of sleep in the middle of the night. We switched on our flashlights and aimed them toward the dense trees. Despite the beams cutting through the dark, the forest seemed to swallow everything, leaving a thick veil of blackness. A sense of dread settled in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was waiting for us in there. Time crawled in that forest. Each minute felt like an eternity, my heart thundering in my chest as though it wanted to burst free. That eerie sensation I'd had when I first saw the doll had returned, sharper and more suffocating. The only thing grounding me was the noise of the woods, the usual symphony of bugs and distant bird calls, oddly reassuring under the circumstances. Maybe 10 minutes later we found him, and then the forest went dead silent. It was as if someone hit a mute button. Ryan and I stopped dead in our tracks, unable to move. I've never felt more exposed. It was like I was being watched, though I couldn't tell from where. I knew those yellowed eyes were on me. I could feel them boring into me, but I couldn't pinpoint his location. My body wanted to flee, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Then I heard it. Quiet, almost imperceptible at first. A labored, raspy breath, like a dog panting. It was soft, but somehow unbearably loud in the oppressive silence. It overwhelmed everything, and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I froze. Something dripped onto my shoulder. My hand shot up reflexively, and when I pulled it away, my fingers were wet. Wet? Out here? My flashlight beam hit my hand, and that's when I saw it. Dark red. Blood. My pulse roared in my ears. My mind raced as I glanced up, and there it was, the source of the breathing. Two glowing yellow eyes stared down at me. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. They were too high up, higher than any human could possibly climb. It was Liam, perched unnaturally high in the trees, his shape barely discernible against the night. His limbs, stretched and contorted, looked wrong, longer than they should have been. His body had morphed into something grotesque, though it was hard to tell if my mind was playing tricks on me. But those eyes, those glowing yellow eyes, I recognized them instantly. In one of his elongated hands was the remains of a small animal, a rodent, or what was left of it. Every time I close my eyes, I still see him up there, staring down. The moment broke, and suddenly I could move again. Without thinking, I bolted. I didn't care where I was going. I just had to get away. I only hoped Ryan was right behind me because I wasn't stopping to check. As I stumbled back into the clearing near our campsite, Todd stood outside his tent. "What's going on?" "I heard someone screaming," he said, alarmed. "I don't remember screaming. In fact, I don't recall making any noise at all. Maybe it was Ryan." Either way, I had no time to explain. "Get in the boat!" I yelled, my voice cracking with urgency. Ryan burst through the trees moments later, panting hard, and clutched his chest to catch his breath. I barely managed to shout the same order to him. Todd, visibly confused, had already dragged one of the kayaks to the water's edge and was preparing a second one. I wasted no time. I flung myself into the first boat, and Ryan scrambled into another behind me. I paddled with everything I had, my muscles screaming in protest, but I didn't care. I needed distance. Now. What the hell is happening? Why are we out here? It's freezing! Todd shouted from his kayak, bewildered. He was still in his underwear, but I didn't care. Neither Ryan nor I answered him. We were too rattled to form words. Eventually, exhaustion set in, and I couldn't paddle any longer. I didn't dare look back at the camp. The idea of catching a glimpse of whatever Liam had become was unbearable. My arms finally gave out, and I collapsed onto the kayak, letting the gentle rocking of the water lull me to sleep. I woke up to sunlight streaming down, the gentle sway of the kayak gone. I had drifted ashore sometime during the night. Looking around, I saw that I wasn't far from camp, maybe 300 feet. Our tents and the other 2 kayaks sat undisturbed on the shore. Someone had gone back. Who would be crazy enough to return to camp? Todd? No way Ryan, after everything we saw, would do something so reckless. My gut told me Todd had made the foolish choice. I glanced around again, spotting Ryan's kayak nearby, just a short distance from mine. I paddled over and prodded Ryan awake. Todd went back, I said, voice barely above a whisper. Ryan, groggy but immediately alert, looked at me with a mixture of confusion and dread. "He did what?" he asked, his voice low and tense. We didn't waste time. We headed back to camp. Oddly, I didn't feel the same eerie sense I had the night before, as if the doll had somehow left the area. But the second I stepped onto the shore, a different unease took over. This time, it wasn't about Liam. It was about Todd. Ryan called the police once we got back to the car. They showed up in minutes. We both told them the same story, that Todd and Liam had gone into the woods at night and never returned. We didn't mention the doll. We left out the part about what we had witnessed in the forest. The search for them is ongoing. It's Wednesday now, and they've been missing since Friday. But deep down, I know, Liam is still out there. And Todd is too. And thanks to everyone for watching. To those who are going to bed, good night. Don't forget to like, and see you all later.